Welcome to Tommy Solo's Famous Friends. This is where I get to chat with people that I've connected with over the years in the world of arts and entertainment. And today, I'm very happy to have with us Jonathan Holiff, whose father managed Johnny Cash and is an award winning documentary filmmaker. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me, Tommy.
Well, it's my absolute pleasure. So let's start in the beginning. I understand that your dad was Johnny Cash's manager throughout his career. And when we were chatting earlier, you said that things got started in my hometown of North Bay, Ontario. So, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's true. And not a lot of people know this story, but what happened was before my father managed Johnny, he was producing cash shows in Canada starting in 1958. And in 1961, they were on a 10-date tour of Ontario that ended up in North Bay. And the reason why that stands out, in fact, is one of the locations in the new movie, is because during that tour, Johnny Cash was trying to reach his manager, a fellow by the name of Stu Carnell back in Los Angeles. And apparently, Stu was a fan of the racetrack. And Johnny was complaining that he could never find Stu when he needed to find Stu. But he finally connected with Stu over a pay telephone backstage in North Bay after that show. And our witness is Johnny's longtime friend, MC, and featured player, Johnny Western. The two guys were outside the dressing room after that show, and Johnny was on the phone with Stu. And basically, Johnny fired Stu because he could never get a hold of him and he had things he needed to get done. And in fact, it was then when Johnny Western turned to Cash and said, "What about that Holiff guy? He's done a great job for us up here in Canada, and you should take a look at him." And they kept talking about it apparently back in Hollywood, and Johnny Western went to work on my dad as well at the very same time, sending him a letter from Hollywood to London saying, and I quote, "Johnny Cash is wandering in a fog, and he needs you, and put your cards on the table regarding a management deal." And that ultimately led to the two men, Cash and Holiff, shaking hands on their new management deal at Gander Airport on October 10th, 1961. And the only thing I would add to that is that had it not been for Johnny Western, there would not have been a Johnny and Saul. And in fact, there probably wouldn't have been a Johnny and June either, because it was my dad 2 weeks after that handshake who hired June Carter and put her with Johnny Cash.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite the interesting story there. So we all know that Johnny Cash went on to have a long and illustrious and successful career, and your dad was instrumental in that. Now, not that long ago, well, I guess a while, 2012, you produced, was it your first film, My Father and the Man in Black?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So, how did you come up with the idea to do that documentary?
Well, what happened really was it wasn't going to be a movie or a book, but my father died. He ended his own life. We had been estranged for many years. And at that point, I went to look in on my mother. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and my parents had a place on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. And I went to look in on my mother, as one does in these circumstances. And at some point, she turned to me and asked me to clean out my father's storage locker that he'd kept for many years. And she had been after him to get rid of it. And my father had passed away, and she was, ready to start the next chapter in her life. And my father and I had been estranged for many years. I wasn't really prepared to go through whatever was inside this locker. I had no idea what was inside. It could have been just, pictures of old girlfriends. Who knows? But I basically let it sit because my father and I had a difficult relationship. And that's when a movie called Walk the Line opened in theaters. And of course, I went to see the film. And growing up with Johnny Cash, as I did, I was 9 months old on my first Johnny Cash tour. I knew, the basics of what my dad did for Johnny, but had only the memories of a child. I didn't know any of the details, and I certainly didn't know how key my father was in Johnny's career and indeed in putting Johnny and June together, which, as you know, led years later to Johnny proposing to June in our hometown of London, Ontario. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Basically, when I saw the movie, I realized for the first time that Johnny was famously arrested in El Paso in 1965, the year I was born, and I started to wonder if maybe I'd been too hard on my dad. And that's when I decided to go straight from the theater to the storage locker and start pulling the material apart. And that's when I discovered that he had basically kept everything that he deemed important from his years working with Johnny. And what began as kind of a personal exploration, trying to find some kind of peace and closure with my dad, who committed suicide, I started to kind of put his story together. And it wasn't until I had some kind of structure emerging that I realized it might merit, a documentary of some kind.
Yeah, I guess it certainly did. I mean, you had global release on that and won multiple awards as well, didn't you?
Yeah, we did well for a documentary. We were in movie theaters, in fact, in the United Kingdom and the United States. But, documentaries are not something you do to get rich. It took 7 years from the time I found a storage locker to the time I delivered the film. So you have to be really passionate to tell these kinds of stories.
Right. Now, are you an independent filmmaker or did you have a contract to produce that film?
No, it was entirely independent. In other words, I made it first and sold it later to Rogers and City TV and broadcasters in other countries around the world. And of course, the theatrical and the DVD when they still made DVDs. But yeah, that's the way these things often begin. I'm hoping that it'll be a shorter route for my new film. But yeah, it was an independent film, raised the money privately, and sold the film at the end of the day.
Well, that's quite the interesting way to go about it, and I guess it's more common than what I knew. And as a musician, I've never done it any other way myself, so I guess that's just the way these things go.
Sorry, Tommy, I should just add that had already been working in television for about 15 years, not as a creative, not as a producer or director, but it's not like I was an accountant finding my father's storage locker. I was already had been for many years telling stories in different ways. So it was just what, was natural for me to do.
Right. I know you've been around the business forever, and I've seen on your social media, I've seen you in photos with people, top shelf performers, and I understand that you worked with Alan Thicke.
Yes, I got my start at CBC in Toronto working on award shows and music specials. I was on the NHL awards for 8 years, not full time, a contract every year for 8 years. But back in 1991, Alan Thicke, your listeners would recognize the name, of course, from Growing Pains, was host. And at the end of the show, he turned to me and invited me to work for him in California, which was incredible for a young guy from Canada. And that eventually led to dual citizenship and work in television on both sides of the border.
And what was your relationship with David Foster?
Oh, none to really speak of. I mean, Canadians in Hollywood tend to bump into one another pretty often. So I've met him a number of times, and I was a huge fan because while I was born and raised in London, Ontario, I went to high school and university in Victoria, British Columbia, where you're speaking to me today. And of course, David Foster is a son of Victoria. And I first met him when I was 17. I paid $50 to go down to the Empress Hotel for a dinner honoring David Foster and I believe giving him the key to the city. So I met him when I was 17 or 18 and several times over the years since then.
Okay, so you just casual acquaintance and you bumped into each other in LA. Well, that's pretty cool. Now, I am curious about the the correlation between the Walk the Line and your film, My Father and the Man in Black, I'm going to assume because you had firsthand information and evidence that your story is a lot closer to the truth. Are there any significant inaccuracies in the other film that you know of? Okay, let's take a short break before Jonathan answers that question to listen to a telephone call from 1971 between Johnny Cash and Jonathan's father, Saul Holiff, where Johnny tells Saul that he is going to be born again as a Christian.
Well, listen, Saul, I've got something else on my mind now. I've got it keeping me laying awake at night thinking about going to Israel. I would do a much better job at is talking and showing about Jesus and his life, you know. I don't know how you go about getting it on the networks, but it seems to me if I had Johnny Cash in Israel following the footsteps of Jesus, you know, for Christmas time.
I mean, now that you have told me, I'll break my ass trying to bring it about.
Well, Saul, make sure they understand. We talked about me being an honest performer. That Johnny Cash is not the same Johnny Cash that is around now.
Uh-huh.
If I do a television special on Israel, I should do it about the life of Jesus, right? Don't you think so?
I would say that in your own way, in a subtle manner, you will follow in the footsteps of Jesus without hitting him over the head with it.
Right.
I still think that it should be labeled Johnny Cash in the Holy Land rather than Johnny Cash in Israel.
All right.
And
okay, sure.
So let me go to work on it.
Well, Saul, I really do have a strong conviction. This is the only thing I want to do.
Now back to the interview where Jonathan was about to answer my question about any major discrepancies between his film and the Hollywood production of Walk the Line.
Well, thank you for saying that. And the only thing I would parse there is truth and words like that. Walk the Line was never supposed to be the truth. Walk the Line is a Hollywood narrative. It's not a documentary. It's not straight journalism. And you know as well as I do, we all do, when we go to the movies and we see that disclaimer at the top that says, based on a true story. Well, yes, of course it was based on a true story, but whenever you tell someone's entire life in less than 2 hours, you know, it's going to be molded in a way to make it entertaining. And as such, it was a great film. I really, really enjoyed it. But yeah, if you're into documentaries, which of course is not about the razzle dazzle, it's about, you know, what happened here, A, B, C, and D, then yeah, you'd find the more accurate historical story in my film. I didn't set out to, you know, make a film like as a musician or someone who's in music as well, you know the whole history of, in particular, country music songs, and then someone writes what they call an answer song. This wasn't an answer song to Walk the Line necessarily, although some reviewers did characterize my film as the non-fiction Walk the Line. And the reason that is because Walk the Line, while it covers Johnny's birth to, say, happily ever after married to June, it really does focus on the period in time that was my father's watch as manager. So we're talking the 1960s and the very early 1970s, actually the late 50s to the early 70s. And consequently, both movies focus on the interesting years. And mine, of course, is a documentary.
Right. Theirs was more of an entertainment film and yours was documentary. I get that. Yeah, now you have a new film in the works, and I'm curious about a few things. During the pandemic, how has that impacted your ability to get things done?
That's a great question. On the one hand, you know, like everybody else out there, it's made things tougher. And I'll get to that in a moment. But on the other hand, you know, you have a lot of time sitting around to fill. And so, you know, it was a blessing in disguise, I suppose. That being said, I never dreamed I would make another movie about Johnny Cash. And the reason why, you know, why now, is because, and people can see these on Facebook, last summer, a Johnny Cash fan in Newfoundland discovered 30 never before seen photos of the 1961 Johnny Cash moose hunt and concert tour of Newfoundland. And I had known about the story, having, of course, researched everything as part of making my first film 10 years ago. But I just had the general dates. I didn't know who was even on that tour aside from Cash, but I did know it was important because that's where my dad and Johnny shook hands on a deal that took them through the ring of fire all the way to Folsom Prison and beyond. So it was very important in that sense, but it wasn't until someone found pictures, and thankfully this wonderful fan basically called me up and said, here, do something with these. And this is in the middle of COVID when I had nothing else going on. So suddenly, as a storyteller who works in film, I had something to put up on the screen, which you kind of need. And that's why I never told the Newfoundland story in my first film. But that being said, I also discovered, to my great surprise, that the fellow who was Johnny Cash's hunting guide in 1961, Heman Whalen, is alive and well in St. John's with a steel trap memory and these wonderful stories of that particular trip. But also my friend, my father's friend, Johnny's longtime friend, Johnny Western, who's retired in Arizona. I picked up the phone and called Johnny Western, and the stories that he shared with me about that tour made me realize that it is perhaps the most important story of all in the Johnny Cash story, because it was then, everything started there in Newfoundland. You know, Johnny and Saul shook hands. They never signed a contract. Who does that these days? But they shook hands. And 2 weeks later, Saul hired June Carter and put her with Johnny. So while I'm not suggesting that my dad made Johnny Cash a star, certainly Johnny had already had a couple of hits on Sun a few years earlier, but his career had stalled for about 2 years at that point when he tapped my dad to be his manager. And then, of course, the rush through the 60s into the early 70s was Cash's heyday. So it's a very important period of time, but it's also set against the wilds of Newfoundland and this idea of a moose hunt and the contrast between struggling to take the stage because Johnny had just begun his challenges with addiction and problems perhaps in his marriage and so on. Contrast that with the photos of him out in nature, a 29-year-old kid looking totally at peace. It really is a snapshot in time, and I think a story that people are going to really enjoy.
I know I'm looking forward to it. It just strikes an interesting image, imagining Johnny Cash with rifle in hand trying to track down a moose. How far along in the production are you on this one?
Oh, it's very early days. The first thing I did, and this goes back to your question about COVID, is that when I found out that Heman Whalen was alive and well in St. John's and 88, and having lost people in the past, for example, on my first film, there were people that I wanted to, who were in the room. These are the kinds of people you want to talk to when you're making a documentary film, not people who, you know, knew Cash and Holiff in the 90s or what have you, but who were actually in the room in the 60s. I lost them because they passed away before I could get them on camera. So I desperately wanted to get out to St. John's, but of course, in order to do that, I would have had to quarantine on the other end because of COVID. So thankfully, because Newfoundland was part and is part of that 4-province Eastern Atlantic bubble, I was able to hire a buddy of mine out of Prince Edward Island to fly over to Newfoundland and to set up all the cameras and everything. And I basically was able to do the interview over the phone, as it were, but there was a crew there recording it. So that happened back in, I believe it was September of last year. And that's when we got started.
Okay. Yeah, and as we were more or less alluding to, it's kind of hard to get things done completely during this, but we are rounding the corner. I can see a light at the end of this tunnel, and that feels good. I know I've got a festival show booked in August, and Boy, oh boy, I don't even know if I'm going to be able to make it through without tears in my eyes, you know?
Yeah, dude, I totally relate. It's nail biting, isn't it? It's really stressful, and I don't envy you. That's a real push. We're going to be in Newfoundland again for our second location shooting in late September, early October. And that's much later than your event. And also, unfortunately, Ontario has fared so poorly under the Conservative government where COVID is concerned, whereas Newfoundland is number one or number two in the entire country in terms of how well they've dealt with COVID. So I think we're going to be okay, but I hope you are.
Yeah, I'm confident. Now we've got, my wife and I both have our second doses booked for this week, and we're moving along a lot faster than what we were. And yeah, there's nothing like politicizing a pandemic, my God. I don't have any more questions for you, Jonathan, but what I do like to do whenever possible is to give my guests the last word. So if there is anything in particular that you feel passionate about, why don't you tell us what that is?
Well, thank you. Would it be too uncool to just plug our Facebook group for the new movie? Because that's where we're breaking the new stuff. And it's really exciting, not just for Newfoundlanders, but for Canadians in general, because a lot of people don't know that so much of the Johnny Cash story took place in Canada. A Canadian manager. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of people don't know that Johnny proposed to June in London, Ontario. And certainly most people don't even know about the Newfoundland trip. So this is very much a Newfoundland story. And, we're doing a big party in Gander on October 10th, inviting Newfoundlanders, fans, to come as VIPs. And these are people, hopefully, who have stories about that 1961 tour, whether they were with their parents at one of the shows or whether they grew up hearing about that time Johnny Cash came to town. So I invite anybody who's interested in following the project to check out the Facebook group called When Johnny Cash Got His Moose, and in brackets, Fan Club.
Right. Well, I was hoping you were going to tell us what the name of it was. At any rate, you know what? I thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to do this with me. And until next time, cheers.
Thank you so much.
Well, who knew that Johnny Cash's career was so impacted by the time he spent here in Canada? And man, wouldn't that be fun to go to a party in Gander, Newfoundland? I don't think anybody parties like the Newfies do. Now, here is a clip from the upcoming documentary When Johnny Cash Got His Moose. And don't forget to check out the When Johnny Cash Got His Moose Facebook group and fan club.
It was a very dangerous situation up there on the Newfoundland tour. Cash, of course, was taking pills and had to leave the show for a while. It was a situation where his voice was just giving out. They asked me to do that final spot on the show. I was recording for Columbia Records at that time, and the second highest rated television show in the world was Have Gun Will Travel. They told me that I was playing to 350 million people a week with that theme song of that show. So the people in the audience were familiar with me for that particular thing. Working with Johnny, I usually introduced him on all the shows. So we had an extremely close relationship, and he always felt that I could jump in if necessary. That made it very easy for me to do the fill-in for Johnny when he was not able to perform on those dates. In fact, some of the pictures that I have seen of that particular tour of the Moose Hunt, shot from behind with the back of the stage and then looking at the audience, it is me at the microphone.
Harry Walters was the director of wildlife when he called me and asked me if I would be interested in guiding Johnny Cash. I was in Millertown doing research on moose. They picked me up at Lake Ambrose and we proceeded to the camp. We stayed in a logging camp that had closed for the season The first thing I remember in the morning was Merle Travis asking us to get out of the sleeping bags and enjoy his coffee. Merle Travis was the gem of the crew. He was witty, always had a joke, sang a lot of his songs. Luther was one in a million. You didn't know if he was a millionaire or a bum. Luther was Luther. Wherever he went, he was loved. Not well liked, he was loved. What I remember so well about Gordon Terry was that he was a very beautiful singer. I can't remember ever hearing anyone that I thought was better. And he loved to sing. And my thoughts was that this guy is really going to go to the top. But I learned after that he was famous as a violin player.
All aboard with that 4-5 girls, that ain't right. Ain't right. I don't sparkle like a pool of pearls, that ain't right. Ain't right. All the girls are real cute tricks, that ain't right. Ain't right. Everybody but me are getting their kicks, that ain't right. Ain't right.
Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a one-man production, meaning that I've done all the work, including producing, editing, guest acquisition, etc. All rights reserved. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The theme song for Tommy Solo's Famous Friends was written and recorded by Tommy Solo with a little help from my friends in the night crew. And hey, if you like the show, why not subscribe? Until next time, cheers.